Right. I love examples, even if they are, not the ultimate optimization of something like the generate and propagate, because they make it abundantly clear that a big part of performance improvements is understanding what dependencies do exist and what things are false dependencies, right? And if you can look at something that's a false dependency and say, oh, we can actually do this at the same time, then sometimes you get the incremental speed up, sometimes you get, really big performance changes.
In fact, as your adders get bigger, this generate propagate stuff actually improves performance on an exponential curve, right? Because you end up, if you were doing a 64-bit add, you're doing it in the same time that it takes a 5-bit add to occur, right? Because most of the stuff that takes time is now, it's the generate propagates, because all the other stuff runs sort of concurrently, right?
Right.
So we actually see some of this in DSP for why FPGAs dominate the very high end of the DSP marketplace. So I'm going to take a little side trip to expand on this thought. So one of the most common DSP functions that is insanely computationally heavy is digital filters. But they're simple, right? They're simple. You take a vector of coefficients and a vector of data, and you multiply each element of the data vector by the appropriate coefficient, right? And the set of coefficients will basically, and so it's actually that the term is sum of products. You may have heard that term. So the product is the multiplier of the coefficient by the operand repeated by n different elements. So if you look at a DSP chip, right, anything from Texas Instruments or Analog Devices for that matter, right, those DSP chips have vector instructions where you point at the coefficient array and the data array, which might have come in from an A to D converter, or it might be a scan line from a video image or whatever. And then it, as fast as possible, fetches two operands at once, multiplies them together, and adds the result. So if you start with two 16-bit operands, you multiply them together, the worst case is a 32-bit result. If you add two of those together, the worst case thing is 33 bits. Right? If both of those 32-bit numbers were near max, right, you'll end up with a 33-bit result. You need one extra bit if you're only adding two of them. If you add four of them, you need one more bit. If you have 8 of them, you need one more bit, 16, 32. So depending how many elements you're adding together, you need more bits in that accumulator, right? So now we look at where does it make sense of how big should that accumulator be? And that in fact will limit how big the array can be before you have to do something special, right? So if you're going to do, let's say, add 4096, well, multiply 4096 operands with 4096 coefficients, right? If that's what you want to do, then your accumulator needs 12 extra bits, right? So it'll be 32 bits plus 12. And if you're doing floating point as a way to avoid doing that, right, of needing extra bits, then you have to consider whether you're really doing the arithmetic you think you're doing, because you're going to start throwing away all your low order bits, because whether you add them or multiply them or whatever, they're going to get pushed out by all the other arithmetic that you're doing, right? So there's a balance of when does, well, first of all, floating point typically is massively slower than integer, right? Typically, except for some chips where they just throw an insane amount of hardware at it and they bring floating point not up to the performance of pure integer, but maybe a factor of 3 to 5 times slower, It depends on the processor and how much silicon you want to throw at it. Okay, so that's how DSP is done in a DSP processor for a common task, which is what I've described to you has a name. It's called an FIR filter, right? So, and it's finite impulse response, and I could go into what that means, but it's irrelevant to this discussion. What's important is that if I have let's say I have a data vector of 1,024 elements, right? Then I've got to do 1,024 multiplies and 1,023 adds, right?
Right.
And so that's going to take me, even if I overlap the adds over the multiplies, and the multiply accumulate section always does that, right? You're up for approximately 1,024 system cycles, plus you've got to fetch 2,048 things out of memory, right? And so if you look at DSP chips, you will find that different regions of memory can be accessed concurrently, right? So in something like a TMS 320 something, you might find that the on-chip memory, which might be a quarter of a megabyte, is broken up into 4 blocks, right, of 128K, and the processor can fetch 4 operands in 1 clock, right? So that lets them, have 2 pointers, both fetching one from the operand list, one from the coefficient list, pushing them through the multiplier, into the adder, into the accumulator, and then keep doing that. It still takes order n, right? It takes 1,024 cycles. How would you ever improve that? And then along comes FPGAs. And FPGAs say, I've got 1,024 operations. I can do the first multiply and accumulate and the second multiply accumulate. I can do them concurrently and store the result if I can fetch enough operands, right? And some of the DSP chips will do that too. Some of them have dual multiply accumulators, right? But there's a limit to how many they have, right? In an FPGA, there are FPGAs that have tens of thousands of multiply accumulators in them. That's current technology. The early stuff, they were measured in tens to low hundreds. But even so, let's say you've got a chip. Let's say you've got a chip that has 1,024 multipliers, right? You can fetch, if you set things up right, maybe you can fetch all 1,024 coefficients all at once. And you can take your data that was coming from an A to D converter, have that going through a shift register that is word wide, and when all 1,024 words are in exactly the right place, fire off all 1,024 multipliers all at once. And you get 1,024 multipliers in one cycle. And you combine the results of 2 of those multipliers. So you actually don't care about the intermediate adds, right? You don't have to store them. All you want is to know the results. So you have 512 adders that combine 2 different multipliers, which on a DSP chip would have been 2 consecutive multipliers. On the FPGA, it's a pair of concurrent multipliers, and you get 512 additions, which all happen in one cycle. You follow those 512 adders by 128 adders, followed by 64, 32, whatever. You end up with about 11 stages deep, right? And so in 11 clock cycles, plus the 1 clock to do all the multiplies, you have the result of 1,024 multiplies and 1,024 adds. You have it in 11 clocks. But each of those stages was only used for 1/11th of that time. So
Right.
take that data that was in that shift register and shift it one position, and now do another 1024 multiplies, and have those results
Right.
marching behind down through that adder tree, right? And
Right.
so
You've got a
now
pipeline.
you've got something that took
going.
1024 clocks, right, to fill the
Right.
pipeline. So that's your startup latency. But after you've paid that
Right.
latency of 1024 clocks, which is a millisecond, you're now delivering
Right.
a result every single clock.
Right. Every
So
cycle,
now, so here's how an FIR filter works. You set up the coefficients to be a pattern that you're looking for, right? And you set up your data is streaming, and it's somewhere in this data is the pattern I want to find. And
Right.
now in a single clock cycle, whereas a DSP chip, it will take 1024 clocks before you can shift the shift register once. In the FPGA, you shift it every clock. So the FPGA is
Right.
running 1024 times faster than a DSP chip. And they both had the same startup latency, right? They both couldn't start until you had
Right.
your first 1024 data items. But the DSP chip won't, after it's shifted everything one position, it's another 1024 cycles until you get an answer. The FPGA, it's
Right.
one clock because they were coming down through the pipeline of adders.
So could the DSP chip could in theory also have 1024 multiply and then the add tree as well, right? It's just that most of the time they do not, and you couldn't control expanding it or contracting it as you needed,
couldn't
right?
make it application specific, and it wouldn't
Right.
be able to do anything else.
Right.
And it would instead of being the relatively cheap price that a DSP chip is, which might be in the $10 to $12, it might end up being like these high-end FPGAs, which are $2,000 to $3,000. But for the FPGA, if what you really needed was that 1024 position FIR filter running at 100 megahertz, delivering a new result every 10 nanoseconds, right? So every 10 nanoseconds, it does 1024 multiplies and 1023 adds and delivers a result, right? That FPGA might cost you a few $1,000s, right? Maybe. I don't know what the current prices are. Maybe it's a few $100s. It doesn't matter, right? The point is, no amount of banging on the side of your DSP chip will hit that performance target, right? And the cool thing for the FPGA is if you only need to do that until the radar says I've now found the target, now switch from search mode to tracking mode, right? That's load a different bit stream and now track the target that you found with that FIR filter, right? Or now go into an image recognition algorithm, or whatever else. By the way, there is of course a two-dimensional version. So what I've described is a single-dimensional FIR. There are two-dimensional FIRs which get applied to images and do things like edge sharpening and blurring or feature recognition, etc. Right? The FIR filter is a workhorse of the DSP domain, which covers image, audio, radar, and almost everywhere where you're dealing with real world signals, right? Other than on and off, right? There are DSP algorithms often involved, right? So and an FIR filter can also boost the bass and trim the treble or whatever else. I mean, it's a general purpose algorithm, and it's functionally easy to implement, but it is computationally heavy, right? And again, it's the example of looking at a DSP chip which is inherently sequential, and the FPGA which offers but doesn't enforce a parallel solution, right? If you're working only with DSP chips, that parallel tree-based solution just never occurs to you because it's not part of the architecture. For the FPGA, it takes a while to reshape into thinking in terms of the extreme parallelism that FPGAs are capable of, right? But that's the reason that, high-end communication systems, satellite communications, wireless, G3, next generation TV distribution, FPGAs are used in all of these systems because they can implement these highly parallel solutions, and you don't have to commit to a custom chip, which when they go and change the standard will now all be unusable. Right. For the FPGA,
absolutely. I've definitely heard that.
Yeah, when the FPGA, when the algorithm changes or the standard changes, the FPGA says, well, okay, send me a new bit stream.